Welcome everyone. I'm Maurice Bisheff and I'm giving an introduction in terms of the history and evolution of organization theory and how it might relate particularly to public administration. Organization theory as a subset of sociology and social psychology, mainly, a little bit political science, has been around for the time since large-scale organizations, other than the military, began to develop in the 1850s. And typically, people wanted to think about and describe and then scientifically study how organizations operated, what happened to people and how they behaved in them, and eventually how organizations could be more efficient and effective in producing large-scale goods and services beyond just a small temporary group or a project, but actually in terms of continuous production and output to provide benefits to people of one sort or another. During this period, especially around 1900, where science began to merge with rationality of organization, you had a population that was very interested, especially in America, but also in Europe, in using science as a technology to produce better things for better people. People were very, in fact, infatuated with the power of organization. And some people even felt that through rational organization, we could achieve external salvation. Certainly in the 20th century, with fascism, communism, and capitalism, all the isms, if all we had to do was be true believers, not question, but just fit in, and let efficient, rational organization show us the way to prosperity and hopefully inner happiness. It was during that period then that organization theory started to blossom, and it's commonly Frederick Winslow Taylor, who was the father of scientific management, an industrial engineer, started to become famous because he actually decided to measure and describe and study how, at least on the shop floor, one could become more efficient in getting one's job done. And so he developed things like time and motion studies, where he actually looked at how long it took to put the bolts into a Model T Ford for mass production. And you could create jobs that were narrowly defined around these different repetitive tasks, such that you didn't cost you very much to train people. And if someone couldn't work 14 hours a day for a minimum salary, you could find someone getting off the boat, because we had massive immigration at this time, to fill the slot. So Frederick Taylor and scientific management allowed us to systematically look at organizations, particularly the shop floor, and had a peculiar efficiency criteria, which showed that human beings were just spare parts, just another factor in production, as economists might say. Nonetheless, that became a major emphasis and a major value in organization theory, is how to create organizations that were more efficient and, for the most part, did their best not to take up too much time with any kind of human values in the process. Now, Taylorism, of course, was part of the whole scientific management movement that occurred from 1900 on, and this notion of efficiency, of course, was also reflected in the public sector, in organization, because people wanted to make sure that people operating in hierarchical bureaucracies didn't go awry with public funds. So you had control measures through hierarchical levels and staff like personnel and human resources and finance, etc., and budget controls and auditors to keep control over people so that they wouldn't exercise their discretion very poorly. So in fact, the whole of organization theory in the 20th century could be seen as basically how do you control the exercise of discretion of human beings when doing their work. And the way to do that is to create laws, rules, and procedures and oversight and scrutinization in manager-subordinate relationships to make sure that everyone did right and followed the prescribed limits of organization. Now this was enshrined by a sociologist who was not an organization theorist but a social theorist, Max Weber, who, when finally translated after World War II to the United States, said that this modern form of complex organization, which provided us these commodities, these goods and services we like, you know, we get our Social Security checks on time, et cetera, that basically this was a new kind of organization. There was hierarchical organization before, but this new kind of organization he called bureaucracy. And he wasn't trying to be too pejorative, though he wasn't necessarily a fan of bureaucracy either. He just noticed the fact that this was a new type. In fact, he called it an ideal type. And in this new type of bureaucracy, you have all the characteristics we're all familiar with a chain of command, specialization of expertise, lines of authority, and impersonal positions as opposed to people. And that this new type of authority all came together because it was based on legal, rational authority, not charismatic, traditional, or tribal authority. So wherein before you would obey the king or the tribal leader, or maybe it would be a charismatic leader that would come along in a movement, here you obeyed, your sense of obligation came from the fact that you were part of a legal, rational component of a large-scale system that is logically tied together with positions, chains of command, to carry out certain values and intentions of a governing body, whether it be a legislature or board of directors. So Weber identified this as something different and something special, and we must realize that even today it is something different and something special, because in most nations, while they have the form of a modern bureaucracy, a lot of it still is cronyism, corruption, hiring of family members, and not necessarily attending to a merit system. So, as much as we might denigrate the bureaucracy as a form of organization, as many do in their speech, red tape, etc., the fact of the matter is that it's sort of amazing that for so long certain nations have been able to keep enough of it, not as totally pure, but enough of it, to actually create a sense of legitimate, rational, legal authority. So the bureaucratic model then has had tremendous success as being the handmaiden of the extension of industrialism. It's the instrument by which industrialism takes place, whether it would be old-style state capitalism, as in Russia, or modern capitalism, monopolistic and oligopolistic as it is in the United States and in Western Europe. Bureaucracy is the handmaiden of these systems. It's the instrument by which large-scale goods and services get produced and reproduced. Now, in this system, however, when we look at public administration in particular, we find that just simply producing things in sort of a machine-like model, where all these elements are linked up in a machine, do have some problems, because bureaucracies are very good at routine tasks, or tasks we all agree on are good. So as I mentioned, Social Security checks get out on time. Even though there are a lot of complications in determining the amount, once the amount is determined, it's a pretty routine job. But when our environment started to change and individuals didn't simply want vanilla and chocolate on ice cream anymore, or strawberry, but they wanted 31 flavors, something happened in the environments of both public and private bureaucracies, where simply having a machine model of just doing routine tasks didn't seem to work anymore. In fact, you had a changing environment where citizens' values were changing and their expectations about what bureaucracies and organizations should do changed. Yet, bureaucracies internally were weighed down by rules and procedures and things. And in fact, over time, the original purpose of a bureaucracy sometimes gets shifted. It's called goal displacement, where instead of attending to the purposes and to the clients and the mission, the goal shifts to maintaining the rules and statuses of the people in the bureaucracy. Goal displacement. So bureaucracies suffer from arterial sclerosis, hardening of the arteries, especially when nowadays with social technology and social media and a globalized system of operating, things are changing so quickly, bureaucracies find it hard to adapt. One way of saying this then is that for the public manager has to be aware of two things at the same time. On one hand, the public manager has to be aware of bedrock situations. What does the situation call for? If it's non-political and routine, you can go ahead and use the values, the actions, and the patterns of a routinized bureaucracy. Now, if we wonder why conflict gets suppressed a lot of times in routinized bureaucracies, is because conflict disturbs the efficient operating of the machine. You have to stop what you're doing and deal with disagreement. And there's an assumption in bureaucracy that, well, you should routinize things enough to have a rule to cover it. And if you don't have a rule to cover it, that means someone someplace either messed up and is accountable for not having that rule, or someone has to take additional time to go create a rule out of their busy schedule. Either way, then, bureaucracy isn't really very amenable to conflict, open discussion and engagement of conflict. Yet, when things change, there are going to be a lot of misalignments of actions to situations, both internally and with customers, that's going to create a lot of conflicts, a lot of needs for adaptation. So the public administrator has to go to another mindset, if it's possible, and move from thinking of things as bedrock to diagnosing whether they're bedrock or more swampy. In a swampy environment, it's the exact opposite of a bedrock environment. The situation is non-routine, sometimes highly political or very ambiguous, where situations are totally ill-adapted to any routines that you have, and that there's a series of unknowns in terms of people's values and how they're going to respond to certain actions, or things are simply unresolved, or just basically uncertain. Now, the public administrator has to act as if they know what they're doing. But in fact, they also have to know that if they're operating in a swampy environment where things are non-routine, they have to act in totally the opposite way as they would as if it were bedrock. So in other words, public administrators have to be schizoid, at least temporarily, because they have to be able to act totally the opposite depending on what the situation calls for. Now, in a swampy environment, for example, if you're going to do planning, if things are swampy and very changing, the best data you can get is to find someone who could lead you through the swamp and take very small steps to make sure you don't step on an alligator and get bit. So finding people who are knowledgeable, who may not be in the chain of command, but finding anyone who knows how to navigate that swamp and going step by step is going to create better data for planning, even though you might have an overall vision or a goal you want to get to, than simply relying on past trends. Because if you simply rely on past trends, they're only good for 18 months, 24 months anyway, and then they have to be updated because the assumptions change. But if you're looking at a general plan, you can't simply look at past trends because the housing market can flip in a second if there's a crisis, or a weather crisis, or an ecological crisis. So if you're in a swampy environment, you can't simply act as if you're in everything's not changing, so you can rely on trends of the past will create trends in the future. You know, environment doesn't change, that's a reasonable assumption. But if the environment is very swampy, you have to do more than that. You have to actually go out into the swamp and find out what's there. It has a higher degree of uncertainty. And you better have knowledgeable people who know the community, have local knowledge, know what's going on, and can do reconnaissance for you and take small steps in order to achieve your aim. A good example might be in the way airports are handled. The San Francisco airport, when they wanted to expand it, they already knew they were going to get environmental resistance. That's almost a given. So they decided to start to make proposals on a small scale and bring in their opposition and have a co-planning session with developers, ecologists, environmentalists, airport planners, city officials. Bring them together and let them begin to co-plan what might be feasible. And even though it's minimal and not one group will get all of what they want, by developing trust and dealing with sorting through different vocabulary and language and time cycles, budget cycles are different for different groups, language is different, so you have the Tower of Babel and you have to deal with that. But over time you can get a working group that is sincere enough in searching for some common ground, minimal as it might be. And in San Francisco, they were able to adapt some of the airport without excessive hassles and excessive conflict in a more collaborative way. In Los Angeles, they developed a big general plan for Los Angeles International Airport. They developed the big plan. They were operating bedrock. And sure enough, when the big plan hit, the big plan sort of got the air taken out of it very quickly, because all of a sudden, out of the woodwork came groups that were going to oppose it, that weren't involved in the beginning, weren't included very much, had to go to court for injunctions, had to threaten. And so you're not off to a very good start, and it really skewed the airport planning. And in fact, nothing happened for a long time except a lot of expenditure of money and bad public relations. So the LA people made the assumption they're operating in a bedrock airport environment, and turned out it was pretty swampy, where the San Francisco people assumed they were going into a swamp and took it more step by step, even though they did have a vision. It isn't pure incrementalism, and you wind up going nowhere or a whole direction you didn't want to go. But they were able to work with people in such a way as to be effective. So we now have a new kind of organization theory. Instead of bureaucratic organization theory and scientific management organization theory, we now have what's called contingency theory. A research and development department operates totally different than a manufacturing department. It's all contingent on the situation. And part of the situation is whether it's stable or whether it's changing, whether it's bedrock or whether it's uncertain. And so now we have a much better lens of understanding the diversity of organizational structuring and behavior, not just for the sake of organization theory, but for a manager being able to act more effectively when they understand the situation and the environment that they're in. They could read the situation and act accordingly, according to at least some rules of thumb. That, of course, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be successful or unsuccessful, but it's better to have some rules of thumb and some guide to and insight into what you're getting into before you act. Now, thus we have contingency theory, and contingency theory of leadership styles and contingency theories of motivation, all of these things then emerged in the 1970s and beyond as a way of saying that there's no one best way to organize, there's no one best way to lead, that it's more contingent than it is just one way to do it, and everyone agrees to do it that way. And that's a reaction to the fact that environments are more turbulent, people's values are changing, they're not stable, etc., etc. Now, nowadays, of course, people not only want 31 flavors, they like the public service they like and are willing to pay for it with a user charge or fight for it. They just don't like all those other public services they don't use. So they're against giving government a carte blanche for more money. But people do like particular public services in the same way they like particular flavor of Baskin-Robbins. But something else has happened. You can call it 1975 or 1980 sometime. In that period, citizens have become better educated, and through the global internet as well as in affluent countries being able to get more education, people have become not only more particular about what they want, whether it's selfish or unselfish, but certainly more particular, but they also want to have some influence in creating the very service or product they consume. So what we have is a much more open system kind of model of organization, where the bureaucratic bedrock system was more of a closed system, where the boundaries around the organization weren't permeated as much. But now, citizens want to co-create their services. They want to co-create a park. So in Santa Barbara, which has a lot of really cool vest pocket parks that you might not find in a tourist magazine, it's really the citizens contributing some of the money, some of the effort, along with the government contributing some of the money, some of the effort, some of the land. So someone might donate the land, the government might create the insurance, citizens contribute the resources, you might have a volunteer architect, and together they, in Santa Barbara, for example, co-produce vest pocket parks. So co-production, which brings citizens together with government, creating more trust and legitimacy with the two, where government's working for them very concretely, and they're working for their government as citizens very concretely, not just voting every 4 years. This notion of co-production in a time when resources are getting slim is seemingly one of the ways in which organizations are becoming more open systems. In the same way, private organizations like Toyota let their suppliers come in to their production plants to make sure there's good coordination between suppliers and maintenance and production, and actually certify their suppliers. So all this is opening up organizations so we can have more precise quality responses, because citizens do want quality services, whether it's public or private. And one of the ways to ensure quality is to let people help co-produce them. Sometimes, of course, that's not easy to do. Sometimes people just have to consult as opposed to co-produce. Other times with public services, we're not really producing public services, we're actually producing public obligations. The IRS produces a public obligation to pay your taxes. The police produce a public obligation to obey the law. But even in these factors, paying attention to the customer and providing better customer service and more modernized customer services with scheduling, et cetera, have helped reduce the gap between the government and the citizens. So we now have then, moving from a closed system, bureaucratic, scientific Taylorism to a more open system, but now government employees need to be knowledge workers, as Peter Drucker said. They need to have discretion to be able to engage and adapt. They can't be just shuffled into roles and over-scrutinized with too many levels of organization, et cetera, producing micromanaging and all the rest of the dysfunctions and game playing that goes on. So this is basically where we are, but where can we go from here in organization theory? Well, there is something that's being worked on now. It hasn't been characterized very well in the past. So I'm just going to call it requisite development, or requisite organization development. And basically, it has sort of two features. One, it starts to say, why do we have hierarchies in the first place? Is it just because people want command and control, oversight and scrutinization, they're power freaks, etc., etc.? Or is there something more manifesting somehow in the affordances, the cognitive tools that human beings bring to situations that create hierarchies? Because they seem to be persistent. For so many years, we want small groups, temporary organizations, networks, yet most of us still want some goods and services made from large-scale organizations. And while we can think very seriously and should think about cooperatives and things like that, the fact is hierarchies, even in cooperatives, still remain. Requisite organization development says that they come from the nature of human beings' cognitive development. Jean Piaget talked about how children learn. Like they go to a chair, a child, and they examine the chair, and pretty soon as they get older, they can understand that this chair is where people sit in. But then pretty soon they go to another chair, but it looks different. It may have 4 legs and a backing. And they begin to associate the fact that there's something called a class called chairs, not just this particular chair. And Jean Piaget said this is the way children learn. But somehow, when it came to adults, this sort of just went by the wayside. But in fact, we now have theory that's been demonstrated and replicated cross-culturally and cross-organizationally that adults also have curves and learning curves very similar to children and very similar to Piaget's logic. Well, there are some differences, but I won't get into the technicalities of it. And basically says that we navigate task complexity in different ways. And this task complexity depends on our cognitive development to be able to handle complexity. So if you're a juggler, for example, if you notice a juggler starts out doing one thing, but then when they add another ball, the shape of their hands changes. The form of their logic changes. Much like the form of the logic in cognitive development of children changed from the one particular chair to the class of chairs. Well, the same thing happens with human beings. And so what happens is, as they're able to handle larger abstractions and larger complexities in their mind, so now they can handle chairs. And in fact, children will start arranging chairs at tables for their parents, right? So they're able then to handle a greater level in space and time of complexity. The assumption then is that with the underlying true levels of hierarchy, people differ in their level and the way they can handle task complexity because of their cognitive development, the way in which they can navigate tasks. So in bureaucracy, a manager does a lot more than simply, or should do a lot more, than simply scrutinize subordinates and give task assignments and evaluate them. Yes, that's a part of it. But it's not necessarily the biggest part. The biggest part is how they're going to navigate their own tasks, their own value added that they contribute as a district manager, as a general manager, or even as a first-line manager. They have their own tasks to do. Each of them have a level of complexity that they have to handle. Those of you who've had managers who aren't big enough for their jobs, quote unquote, or can't carry the can in their jobs, as the British might say, know that micromanaging and all sorts of dysfunctions begin to work. We work as a team, etc., etc. So we can now, through knowledge, identify the level of cognitive development in relation to the task complexity that people can do. And so we can begin to set up levels of work systems depending on the complexity of the task. Now, to some extent, this recapitulates hierarchy, but now we're viewing hierarchy as anchors for learning. Because as people learn to navigate their tasks differently, they just don't stay at these levels, but we're all learning and we're all developing, much like the child learns to develop the chairs. And so this becomes a way in which people can exercise a comfortable amount of discretion and to begin learning, but at the same time contribute to the organization's purpose by engaging requisite levels of task complexity. There is another piece to this, however, that's important, because otherwise you could say, oh, you've just recapitulated a bureaucracy, it's just more rationalized. You're just doing Max Weber a favor by operationalizing Max Weber's ideal type of bureaucracy. Well, the interesting thing is that because things have become more swampy, particularly in public organizations, we can now begin to essentially institutionalize and reward people for handling a swampy approach, where they use their discretion and their adaptive ability and capabilities without depending on roles. So when things are changing, for example, even when you're in a nominal bureaucratic hierarchical structure, you let the situation determine who's involved in solving the problem. And in solving a problem, it takes more than one person to solve it. You need to gather collective intelligence from relationships from all of those who actually contribute to either accomplishing a task in the first place, because you don't do it alone usually, and reach out when necessary to develop whatever expertise is needed. So as a result, the situation is the leader, and the superior and the subordinate in position authority are both followers. It's the situation that's the leader. And in many senses, and in many examples in public organizations, sometimes it's the contractor who's specialized in a situation, who discovers things, and tells the engineer who actually endorses and certifies the project and the project sponsor what to do. Yet they're nominally the, quote, subordinate. And in the armed services, many times, especially in the Navy, that's dependent a lot on engineers, it's the civilian engineer that might tell the Navy officer what's needed to build that bridge or to accomplish the task. So our picture that we have in our heads of top-down bureaucracy, control freaks, and dominance and power sometimes is misguided. It's not a very true description of the way work actually gets done. In spite of micromanaging, in spite of intrusions, work gets done because people know how to act informally. They know how to act and are drawn to solving problems because that creates meaning in their work for them and service for the people that are their clients. And yes, they feel many, many times in bureaucratic organizations limited, that they really can't do what's right or the fullest job needed because of legal restrictions and resource restrictions, etc., etc. But nonetheless, there are amazing jobs done. So we have recursive organization, not just top-down organization. And recursive means that you have unfolding interlocking cycles of different perspectives encountering each other and having to solve problems. Look at court administration, the most complicated maybe of all public services that I've seen, more complicated than hospitals. At that court, you have to get everyone together in the right place at the right time with the right paperwork, with the right procedures. And it's amazing, despite all the delays and peculiarities of the justice system, so to speak, how the justice partners, quote unquote, all the agencies have to coordinate. And here you have a court administrator who has to coordinate all these things and get people to court on the calendar at the right time at the right place. The court administrator has to work usually with an associated presiding judge. And the presiding judge is not the court administrator's manager. The presiding judge does not do the court administrator's performance appraisal. The presiding judge does not hire and fire. Court administrators, much like city clerks, are actually ministers of the state of California in a very technical situation. But yet the presiding judge and the court administrator on site in the district or on site in the central county location, for example, they have to work together. Many times they meet every day to work out, well, the judge can't make it here, an attorney says they have a problem there, da-da-da-da-da. So they're constantly acting not in a hierarchical command and control system. Because remember, the court administrator has a certain amount of power. The court administrator knows when the calendar gets bogged up. And it's not great publicity for the justice system or for judges to hear that there's a backlog of cases, like there are, for example, in Queens, New York right now. It's been in the New York Times. So both the judge has an incentive to work with the court administrator so they don't have these kinds of informational feedback problems. And the court administrator needs to work with the judge to get the judge's cooperation on matters of procedure in order to get things working. So you have this amazing encounter, both at micro level and other ways, to really have a recursive organization that relies on cooperation, relies on adaptive response to all kinds of contingencies that happen on a daily basis. Yet they operate in a very complex system, where in metropolitan court systems you might have 20,000 cases a year. And that's just in one court, like civil, let alone criminal and family court, et cetera, et cetera. So what you find, and I'm sure you find this in hospital administration, despite the status structures that go on and the snobbiness that goes on sometimes, in hospital administration, that you have people that actually cooperate to do joint problem solving. And when you naturally do joint problem solving, you let the situation determine who can handle the problem complexity, who has the source of the information. So in a strategic planning process, it was the custodian that said, we don't have a place for our cleaning supplies at our stores, which is why the enterprise strategy of having the cleanest stores to compete against the competition didn't work. It was the custodian that had the key piece of information. But fortunately, they weren't working in such a top-down, one-way communication that they ignored the custodian. Rather, they actively elicited the custodian in a diagonal strategic planning process that included everyone from top to bottom, not just the top. Strategy is just not at the top. But we have all these images of hierarchical and status at the top, when in fact, complex organizations, especially public organizations, don't work that way. That's a very poor description. Yes, bureaucracies and job descriptions and classifications work for the outsider. Well, who's sort of accountable here? Or what's going on here? What are the functions? So yes, bureaucracy and who's accountable to the governing board, it is a contingent factor. It should not be totally excluded. But to simply focus on hierarchical scrutinization and task evaluation is just a very poor description and a very poor way of improving, I might add, the performance of public organizations. Now that we have requisite organization development theory, we know who can solve and has the capacity to help solve problems. So you can locate what problem the situation emerges and who should be involved, who can contribute, and you can do joint problem solving and have recursive organization, yet reflect a hierarchy, but it's one of merit, of expertise, of cognitive development, not one of simply status and command and control from the top. So we've now come full circle in organization theory from power over, from the top, to power with a new model of recursive organization where we account for what is a true hierarchy, but that true hierarchy is based on people's problem-solving abilities, based on their ability to handle complexity and their ability to work with the contributions and expertise of others at all levels to be able to solve problems and to develop an adaptive capacity to deal with more swampy environments. So this is maybe the next generation of organization theories. Thank you.